Let's go. Let's go. Okay. Thank you very much for coming, everyone. I'm just going to do a very kind of short introduction here to your speakers and to the topic. We're here to discuss how we as liberals and also as a kind of European international community can influence the outcome of the war in Ukraine from a municipal, EU, social media and international perspective, and really to attempt to work out, if possible, where we go from here and what the future looks like in this new world we find ourselves in. And on the panel, we've got Flo Klukas, the finance spokesperson for the Council of European Municipalities and Regions, Irina von Weisse, a former MEP and Vice Chair of the European Parliament Subcommittee on Human Rights, Caitlin Richardson, the Co-Communications Officer for the Young Liberals, and Dr. Christine Cheng, a Senior Lecturer on International Relations in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. And what I'm going to do is kind of take them in that order for a little introduction to the topic from their perspective. And so just for some housekeeping, when we open the Q&A, I will keep an eye on the chat and see what you're all thinking, talking about. And while you are not participating, if you could keep yourselves on mute, that would be spectacular. And without further ado, I will hand over to Flo for the municipal side of things to start with.
Well, thank you very much, Hannah. I suppose I really ought to say right at the beginning that as well as being the CEMR finance spokesperson, and that is an organization that doesn't just deal with the European Union, but with about 40 countries in Europe, those inside and outside, and it also deals extensively with the European Commission and with the European Council as well. And one of the things that I think it's important for us to understand is that that body represents a huge number of local and regional authorities right around Europe. And the voice of those local and regional authorities is currently being gathered. And indeed, to date, approximately 750 leading municipal figures, mayors, deputy mayors, mayors of regions, and so on, they have actually signed a letter saying that they want Ukraine to be properly treated, its citizens to be properly treated. And the way things are being done is an outrage to humanity. I've been proud to sign that letter because I think, and that declaration, because I think if we don't make our voices heard, who else will speak? That's the question. In Cheltenham, I'm proud that we are a town of sanctuary and we welcome refugees. At the moment, we have quite a sizable group of Afghan refugees here. And we are waiting with bated breath, in fact, to welcome some of our Ukrainian refugees. One I know is on the way, others are a little less far along the road. But if we as towns and cities, not just in the UK, but elsewhere, can bring our strength to bear on an impossible situation, then we can perhaps make a difference. And CEMR, the Committee of the Regions, the European Parliament, all are adding their voices to this. And I think that's a great thing to do. What I would say is that I think as politicians, we actually have a significant role to play in this because we are here representing many, many millions of people. And certainly talking to my constituents as I am now, their concerns are what's happening to the women, to the elderly, what's happening to the children, what's happening to those with special needs. How on earth can a soldier shoot a 6-7-year-old dead because they say he's a Nazi? All of these things really have to be countered. We have to fight them. We have to make sure that reason holds out during the course of the day. And this is why I think it's desperately important for parties like ours, and indeed other parties in the UK, where we can, to work together to make sure that everything that we do is aimed at ensuring that those people in that situation in Ukraine are properly treated. And the other area I would like to mention just before I finish, and I'd like Christine, if I may, to to comment on this, given her situation. I'd like to know how we can influence what China does, because China is going to be a really big player in this. And I know the Chinese communities, both here in Cheltenham and in Liverpool, where I was a councillor for 26 years, and in other parts of the country, are actually very concerned that their own country is being seen as not to have an influence with Putin and co. So what I would like to say to you is that from a municipal perspective, firstly, the EU is giving a lot of money to help towns and cities, to help Ukrainian people, towns and cities. And that will be required more so when this war is over, to help Ukraine to rebuild. But secondly, those of us who are councillors, who are in a situation where we can do positive things, are in a position where we can actually offer our hand in friendship and offer what we can to help those people in those desperate situations to find somewhere that is safe, somewhere their children can grow, somewhere they will feel not threatened. And I wish our government would take this seriously. And I look forward to hearing what Irina has to say in relation to this, and indeed Christine too, because our government has to be one of the slowest, one of the most incompetent, one of the most paper-driven organizations on the planet when it comes to dealing with this. So I look forward to hearing from you. I hope that responds in the way that you wanted, Hannah. If not, then please tell me that was a load of twaddle and say something else, okay?
No, that was wonderful. Thank you very much, Flo. And I'm sure we'll definitely touch on the China aspect of things in the Q&A. I will go over to Irina now for the European perspective as to what the outcome of this crisis might be, and what could be a good outcome if one was possible for Ukraine in Europe and for liberal democracy.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you for everybody attending today. And before I talk about EU, I just wanted to say very briefly that I'm really proud that Lib Dem women took on this topic, because women have been at both the military and the political front of this war. We've seen images of female politicians, including the leader of our partners, a party, sister party, Rolos, and others who were repeatedly talking on behalf of their country with their Kalashnikovs sitting next to them, women who fought at the forefront of the military and in civilian positions in Ukraine. But women, of course, have also been victims of this war, as we've seen in the horrific detail of human rights abuses in Bucha and elsewhere. Victims of rape still being one of the most horrendous weapons still used worldwide as a weapon of war, but also victims of human trafficking. Many of the women and girls who fled Ukraine, often without their fathers or husbands, were at risk of further abuse after they managed to escape. And I think we have to think about this and what role really women play in such a conflict on both sides. So that's just as a preliminary remark. And if what I would say later about the role of the EU sounds a bit sort of dry and focused on more of the economic aspects, it is certainly not to forget the very real human cost and the horrendous atrocities that are going on right now as we speak. The EU has certainly reacted in a way that I, as a passionate pro-European and former MEP, would not have thought possible. The acceleration of action in all of the European institutions, but particularly in the Commission, has been really quite remarkable. Also in terms of cohesion, so a very, very fast reaction in terms of sanctions, in terms of the economic response to the crisis, and we've really seen European member states go together. The question is now, for how long? There are first cracks visible. There is obviously going to be a different price to be paid by citizens in different EU member states and in the UK, by the way. But this price is going to be high in most member states and very, very high in some, including my own original a country of origin in Germany. So we will see how long this unity is going to be preserved. A good outcome, well, what is the good outcome in light of this? I mean, the only good outcome I can think of really is that the atrocities stop now. And that's not a good outcome, because that will still leave thousands and thousands of people dead, displaced, or injured. So I don't think there is a good outcome. But of course, going forward, I think the EU will need to emerge from this as a much, much stronger force, as a force who is prepared to stand up to aggression, not just by Russia, but elsewhere, and potentially a force who is also stronger militarily, which of course is controversial. But I think foreign security policy is going to be very high on the agenda, and potentially foreign defense policy at EU level in the future. And we can talk about that a little bit later. So a good outcome, I don't think there is a good outcome possible anymore, but maybe mitigating the worst by trying to force Putin into some form of retreat is the best outcome we can hope for now.
Okay, thank you, Irina. And yes, the thing we always have with Europe is it's forged from crisis to crisis. So this will be perhaps what makes them start taking European defence much, much more seriously, as we've seen. And I'm now going to move on to Caitlin for social media. And I've seen some of these women fighters sharing memes on Facebook about how to capture a Russian soldier, mocking them about washing machines, I think, in recent days. So what more can you tell us about the role of social media in this conflict?
Yeah, hi. So I hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm Caitlin, I'm one of the communications officers at Young Liberals. And I also have a master's in international relations, so I know a little bit about what I'm talking about, I hope. Before I get into that question, I just want to talk a little bit about the work that Young Liberals has done on this, or YL, I'll refer to them as YL, because we've really been as much as we can towards the forefront on this, both within the party and outside of the party. We brought a motion to our winter conference in Edinburgh that passed resoundingly, that much of that motion formed the basis of the motion that then went to federal conference, which of course we work very closely with the Federal International Relations Committee on that. And we're incredibly proud of the work that we've been doing there, especially our international officer, Peter, and his international committee have been doing some really outstanding work on this. And we are the only UK youth wing that's really properly united on this and properly in support of Ukrainians. The Conservatives can't say too much because of fear of upsetting the government. Labour's absolutely tearing itself apart over this. We are the only youth organisation with a really united front. We're working really closely with our sister organisations in Ukraine, hearing some absolutely heartbreaking stories coming from there, but also some really inspiring stuff too. And we're also really proud to be working with our Russian sister organisations, people that are standing up against war there, incredibly brave for doing so, being arrested and worse. We're so proud because young people are so often told to stay out of the room for conversations about foreign policy, that we don't know what we're talking about, that we haven't been around long enough. And so we're so proud that throughout this crisis, we have been able to be at the forefront to do as much as we can to support Ukrainians in any way that we can, because we really feel that it is our absolute most basic responsibility as Liberals that we should be doing that. In terms of the social media side of things more specifically, I think it's an interesting one, because Russia's power, its soft power before this crisis, we now know it was all smoke and mirrors. They've lost their soft power. That Russian dirty money is finally being flushed out of the city of London, about 20 years too late. But they've also lost some of the fear that we might have had over their hard power. Their military isn't what people feared it might be. Ukraine, you know, with all the respect in the world, is not a military powerhouse, and they're holding Russia at bay. And as incredible as that is, that just shows that Russia is not the force to be feared that we should think that it might be. And we're seeing this largely because of the media and of social media. It's incredibly brave Ukrainians, a lot of them young Ukrainians, that have stayed behind to witness and to document this war and to show us what's happening. And without them and their sacrifice, we wouldn't have nearly as clear a picture. We would just be subject to the propaganda, mostly from the Russian side. So it's thanks to them that we know what's going on. And hopefully because of that, we can build on their sacrifice and on their work. Hopefully on now the way out of this crisis eventually, and we can really build on this moment of unity, international unity, like Irina was referring to earlier. This is the European Union so unified on this, NATO is so unified on this, that it would be an astounding waste if we didn't take this as an opportunity to really unify against Russian imperial aggression. And we can do that largely because of what we've been seeing on social media, because of what's been shared by the brave young Ukrainians who stayed behind.
Thank you, Caitlin. And it's also very important to remember that a lot of these people are the people who are documenting war crimes and evidence of war crimes. And turning to the international perspective, it would be interesting to discuss with you, Christine, as to where we go from here, reaching a negotiated solution to the conflict, holding human rights abusers to account. Where do we go next?
Oh, such easy questions you've posed. Hi, everyone. I'm Christine Chang, and I work on this stuff full-time for a living. You can imagine how depressing it still is after all this time, many decades thinking about these issues. And every time something like this happens, it's still utterly despairing. And I was just thinking about Flo's comments and looking at some of the images that have come out. And there's no way to get around the brutality of it all, right? So I want you to take my comments kind of, I'm going to give you some very realist sort of comments. That doesn't mean that I'm not obviously feeling this in my heart, but I'll give you the kind of international relations perspective on some of these elements. And I want to try and answer one of the questions, sort of along the lines of what Hannah was moving towards, you know, what would the outcome be, but meshed with that question that was asked of us, that Irina tackled. I'll reform it slightly differently. So the question was, what does a good outcome look like? And I think maybe we could rephrase it as, what is the best possible outcome at this point? And the difficulty here is that the best outcomes, I think, for Ukraine are not necessarily the best outcomes for NATO, for the UK, for Western Europe, and for the US, right? I think there's actually a split here, and that makes it quite difficult, right? So, and we can also separate again between the Ukrainian leadership versus the Ukrainian people. In my mind, the best outcome for the Ukrainian people is, like most of you would probably agree, the war ends as soon as possible, and we minimize the atrocities and the civilian deaths going forward, right? That's the best outcome. And I actually think that in a slightly different world, that would be possible at this point. I don't think it's possible realistically, though, for a variety of reasons. And the chief one has to do with a set of expectations that have now been built up on the Ukrainian side, and then the expectations that have been built up on the Western side, so on behalf of NATO countries and the US and the EU in particular. So if you're thinking about it from a US power, a NATO power perspective, and again, let's also divide between Western European nations and Eastern European nations. So Eastern European nations are quite terrified about what Putin will do. They've always been terrified. They've always said to us in the Baltic states, this person is going to cause big trouble, just you wait. And he's just been waiting, right? And look at Georgia, look at Ukraine in 2014, look, and we never paid attention, right? So they've always said, this man is dangerous and he will go all the way. He is, from their eyes, he is Hitler, right? He cannot be stopped, and he is the kind of imperialist that Caitlin was talking about, right? That there's no amount of containment that can stop this person. He will go all the way, and he's shown his willingness to go all the way. The Western Europeans don't quite see it that way. They think he can be contained, right? So France and Germany, I think, see Putin as somebody that can be negotiated with. And there's the division there. And the division obviously also has to do with how close you are to the border too, right? So, and then the US, I would say, sees this as an opportunity, my guess is, to weaken Russia as much as possible, to humiliate Russia as much as possible, and to take this opportunity to bleed Russia to death as much as possible. And even if the war were to end tomorrow, I don't think the sanctions are going to be lifted, right? Maybe some of them, but most of them not. So I think you've got this contradiction here around what even the West wants, some of those splits that Irina was referring to. But the difficulty here really is that the ideal end game, from my perspective, is to see the Ukrainians, fewer Ukrainian civilians die, but that's not, I think, and even though they're not coming right out and saying so, that's not actually in the interest of NATO, and frankly, for the UK, right? So that's, I think that's the real tension here. And I'm not sure where Zelensky himself sits. And the US and other NATO powers have always said, this is always going to be up to Zelensky. He decides when the war ends. But of course, it's never that simple, right? There are all these other tensions. And so he's asking for a form of security guarantee that's basically joining NATO, but not joining NATO. That's his ideal scenario, right? He gets all the security guarantees so that if Ukraine is ever attacked again, then other nations will come in and step forward and fight Russia. I don't know that he's going to get that. I'm not sure that anybody wants to go in that direction. I mean, just reporting in the news that Germany is having that discussion with them quite seriously. There may be other nations behind the scenes also doing the same. So I think that's kind of what the situation looks like in terms of the tensions. And, if you ask me, it looks like who's going to play this very, very terrifying game of chicken where Zelensky blinks first because he's willing to take, how many civilian casualties is he willing to take before he will just take some form of a deal? And then what does the pressure look like behind him to take the deal or not take the deal from the NATO side? And what form of support is our Western nations willing to offer in order to get him to not take the deal and to keep bleeding Russia for as long as possible? And then on, Putin's side, the question is how many people is he willing to keep killing? And I think the answer is a lot, until, he for whatever reason, might choose to change his mind, right? And he's willing to walk away with some piece of territory. But of course, the Western side would say, we can't let him have any territory because that sets a precedent for aggression and allows him to reap the rewards of aggression. So I think that's kind of how I see things. That's not really an answer. That just is, my version of the analysis. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. And I've been taking lots and lots of notes over there quite frantically during that last one. So I think now if we start to move towards questions, I do not see anything in the chat. And if you do not intervene, I will start to go through my list of questions. I'll see if I can see anyone else in the gallery with anything. Nope. Okay, so if I start from a municipal perspective, perhaps, but it touches on some kind of European things as well, and anyone can come in on any of these at any time. If we look to the future for Ukraine, President Zelensky stated there'll be a special state program for reconstruction of every city affected by the Russian invasion. I've got local government here, but any of us really, what can we best do to contribute to reconstruction and rebuilding of Ukraine in the future? which we'd all like to see and assist with. Do we have any people jumping in at me here?
I'll have a few words if you like.
Okay.
I think there are several things. One of the things I would wish to ask Christine, if I may, and she can come in later, is the situation in relation to the relationship between Russia and China and how that might be helpful in this situation. Secondly, how that might impinge, for example, on the Chinese situation with Taiwan and also on the situation between North and South Korea. It would just be interesting to have your perspective on those. In relation to what's going to happen in Ukraine once hostilities cease, I think that's extremely difficult. The European Union will be helping European cities and regions to enable money to be spent in Ukraine, helping to rebuild. That will be a heck of a job, given what we have seen. Where I think local and regional government here can help, and potentially across Europe too, is actually in a number of ways. The first would be looking at expertise, because my bet is that a lot of those who would have been able to help with construction will no longer be there. A lot of the equipment will no longer be there. A lot of the ideas, a lot of the new opportunities, for example, with internet connections and so on, will no longer be there. So I think that's one mechanism through which local government here, for example, could help by offering advice and offering expertise. I think the second area where UK government, local government could help would be in looking at what the children in Ukraine need. Because those children will, all of them, those children and young people will have been traumatized by what they have witnessed, traumatized by the experiences that they have had. And so from that perspective, I think regional and local government councils, towns and cities of sanctuary could be very helpful. That doesn't mean that we would have lots of kids coming here, but it might well mean that we have people going to Ukraine to help work with them and help re-establish community there, which has gone. I think that the third issue is actually in relation to health and well-being, because health and well-being in much of Ukraine will have gone. And so helping hospitals to be rebuilt, helping local people to have proper health facilities, I think will be extremely important. And all of that takes money and expertise. And with the best will in the world, the only way that Ukraine is going to be able to afford that is to have international cash behind it. Because without that, nothing will happen. So I think there are a range of areas where local and regional government could help. We do already, for example, helping our sister party in Russia, Yabloko, to meet people, to talk to people. Whether that will still be possible later is a difficult situation. In Ukraine, building politics again might be helpful too. And that's where, again, cities and regions and parties such as ours can come in and make the difference. So I'm happy, as I say, if you have any questions about some of the work that's been going on, I'm more than happy to answer them. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to come in on that one? I've got a lot of questions kind of rolling in the chat now. Thank you. If there's no one else, I am going to pick iPad Catherine. Apologies if I read your names as they are written on the the screen. Would you like to ask your question, or shall I ask it for you? Okay, I can ask it. That's fine if you're not. How does the outcome change if/when Putin is indicted as a war criminal? Getting the big questions in here tonight. Do we have any takers on that one? I see. Okay, I'll go Irina and then Christine, due to the time constraints involved in Irina's evening.
I'll have a go. I try, but I'm afraid I don't have much optimism to offer in this respect. in order to be indicted and tried, first there needs to be a tribunal. As you may know, the ICC has been is dependent on member states signing up to it. Clearly, Russia hasn't signed up to it, but neither has the United States, by the way, which makes it harder in terms of credibility for the ICC to do anything. And secondly, the ICC, like most courts, rely on somebody being actually in court present, and that means somebody would have to be extradited. And I somehow do not see anybody extraditing Putin from Russia. The second problem is, even if another tribunal was set up, and of course there have been calls by a number of states, including Britain, to set up some form of Nuremberg tribunal, the famous letter by the former prime ministers, which is all a very good idea, but again, you can only try somebody who has been extradited, who is there in court. And even in the miraculous event that somehow somebody got hold of Putin, or there was a regime change and somebody was going to put him in front of such a tribunal, the question is what would be achieved. And of course, there is the question generally of trying to get justice for war crimes that are committed, or some form of reparations which could be paid in the future. I think there's so many steps from here to there. My hope is that there will be some form of, more likely internal than external, coup against Putin, probably not coming from the oligarchs because they are mostly in his pocket, but probably coming from his inner circle, the military, in as far as they still have the guts and the ability to speak up. Some of them seem quite hierarchic. And then there will be some form of new regime, and Putin will then be somehow held to account. But that is as far as my hopes go, and I wonder what Christine thinks about this.
Irina, I totally agree with you, sadly. I think there's almost no hope in hell that he'll ever be indicted, and it's just impossible given how things are set up. You can't, Russia is part of the Permanent Five in the Security Council. So in order for things to be taken forward, they have to go through the Security Council. I mean, there are other ways, but the main route is through the Security Council. And obviously, as part of the P5, Russia just vetoes that and it's over, right? So that's just not going to happen through that route. There are other routes, and Irina mentioned a couple of them, right? One is hoping for something internal to happen at the point where you no longer have a sitting head of state. And it is actually possible to indict a sitting head of state. It's just incredibly difficult, and it will never happen with a permanent member of the Security Council. So there are all sorts of structural difficulties, even with somebody who used to be a head of state. It's incredibly unlikely and incredibly difficult. Again, not totally impossible, has been done. Slobodan Milosevic, right? There's another example, but we're not talking on the same scale. So I would just say straight up geopolitical reasons, that's unlikely. If you're thinking about justice, it is possible and perhaps more likely that you'll get people at a lower level. And maybe, frankly, it won't happen in the next 5 years. It might happen in 20, right? So a lot of the things that we're talking about in terms of transitional justice don't necessarily happen in the immediate aftermath. Sometimes it takes decades, right? So we had the tribunals for the Khmer Rouge many decades after the atrocities and the genocide happened. And sometimes you don't ever get any of that, right? So there are different ways in which to get justice, but I think all of those things would require the kind of regime change. And I think regime change of Putin is, in the immediate future, highly unlikely for a whole variety of reasons. He's deliberately coup-proofed the people, his situation, to ensure that the military and the oligarchs and the security people around him can't take him out in that way. He's incredibly conscious of social unrest and is very happy to use repression at all, you know, in any kind of disturbance. So you can see what's happened to Navalny. And I just think it's with somebody who's willing to be that brutal, you're not going to see the kind of, well, you just require so many people to come to the streets, and it's not happening. And speaking to the disinformation side of this, many people in Russia support this war, right? And I think that's something that we don't see. We can talk about why that is the case, and obviously they're getting very different information than we are, and the justification behind the war is really different, but that just creates a different kind of, well, a lack of willingness to come forward and fight or to protest in the streets, right? So all of the avenues that lead to him leaving office, voluntarily or not voluntarily, I just don't see that those are plausible. I think it's going to get really, really, really ugly before he'll ever go, and I don't see him ever being indicted. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry to hear that as well, but sadly we don't live in an ideal world. The next question I'm going to take is from Joseph. Does Zelensky deserve any stick for nationalizing the media and restricting opposition parties, or is he just? Do we want anyone to come in on that one? I'm deliberately kind of asking you the big controversial questions.
I can try and say a bit if you like.
Okay,
Go ahead,
sorry.
Joe.
Okay,
Oh, sorry, who was it? Caitlin?
we've pinned Caitlin, so we'll go with Caitlin.
Right.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak here in terms of my own opinion, rather than necessarily the whole opinion of YL, because I don't think we have a policy on this specifically. But I think that we generally believe in the you go low, we go high principle. And so I think on that note, while, you know, I don't think there should necessarily be any any repercussions for him doing this, I think it's something that we shouldn't be praising for certain. We can't ever be seen to praise repression of democracy anyway. But it's also worth noting that a lot of the opposition parties that have been restricted are a significant threat to the national security of Ukraine. And I think if many countries had parties existing that were such existential threats to that country's future existence, then yeah, I think a lot of countries would act in a very similar way. And you know, there are certain restrictions on parties in the UK, for example. And so I don't think it's necessarily something that's only happening in Ukraine that's not happening elsewhere. But yeah, I think as liberals, we should generally stand against that sort of thing. Like I said, I don't think it's helpful for us to be out saying, oh, Zelensky's doing this wrong, Zelensky's doing this wrong. But I certainly don't think we should be praising it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from there. We're kind of in the paradox of tolerance space, as in whether you should or could allow people who are out to undermine the concept of liberal democracy to benefit from the freedoms that liberal democracy provides. Irina, you wanted to come in on that one as well?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, and it's a moral dilemma to some degree. And whilst I agree in principle that we should not compromise on democracy, I mean, let's face it, this is an extraordinary situation. It's literally a fight for the very existence of his country, of his people, for survival. It's not your usual, oh, you know, do I want a majority vote for my tax increase or not? and sticking together and having the maximum amount of unity within your own ranks seems to be absolutely crucial if he wants to have the minimal chance of surviving this, right? So I don't know if any of you saw the really interesting interview with Sarah and Kira Rudik from Warlos, who of course is an opposition party. Sorry, that was at our conference, and Kira did actually have thinly veiled criticism of Zelensky, as you may remember sorry, it was Leila, not Sarah, when Leila Moran asked her, you know, or said something about there are 4 liberal parties, of course, in Ukraine. She said, no, there's only one, and that is us. And she certainly used to be quite an open critic of Zelensky and his servant of the People Party, who is now incidentally on the verge of becoming a member of ALDE. So these internal divisions, of course, still exist and will exist once the war is over. But I do think that in these extraordinary times where Zelensky has shown to be an absolutely extraordinary communicator and leader, literally trying to hold the morale of his people together, and potentially, you know, if they do win this war in a way that any war is ever winnable, then it will be in no small part due to his leadership. I do think we can forgive some restrictions on freedom of expression, so long as they are being restored as soon as that is possible again.
Thank you, Irina. I, being the moderator, we're not here to hear from me per se, but I'm on the ALD Council at the moment, and it will be us and Congress who need to make the decision about the Servant of the People's membership of the ALD party. And I'm usually quite harsh on new members because I want to make sure that they share our values, particularly around defending the rights of LGBT plus people. And I will continue to hold all of our members to account on that. But in this particular case, I'm going to cut them a little bit of slack, or rather a lot of slack, surrounding the rules of liberal democracy that we would otherwise demand that are upheld, because of this exact issue that we face with the paradox of using liberal democracy to destroy liberal democracy. I very much recognize that there is a time and a place, and I'd be happy to have them as members, and we'll all hold each other to account in the course of debate, as we always do within ALD. So the next question I'm going to take is about the rest of the world's take on this, from Helen Cross, because I can see people are discussing this in the chat, and I thought I'd bring it into the verbal space. What's the rest of the world's take on this? Are we in a European bubble of consensus? How does the West have to bring the rest of the world with us? Christine, you were sharing some articles in the chat there, I see.
Yeah, I was, and I think this is a really important thing to do, is to go out and look at other countries and how they're seeing this dynamic, because it's so easy in our own media bubbles to, especially if, you know, we're only following Lib Dem members and people who are really center or center left in the UK, although the UK seems relatively united on this front. But if you look in China, you know, from the very beginning, you'd be surprised. I was surprised. The whole conflict was really cast as one where the US is the evil empire. And pretty much no matter what happens, the US will be cast as the evil empire. And there is a narrative that works with that, right? So, and there is also a lot of discussion of moral equivalence with what happened in Iraq. And if we strictly take the facts, and this is not a coincidence, by the way, right? So Putin did think very carefully about the circumstances and the narrative that he's telling about under what conditions and why, and the justifications. And a lot of it is mirrored around what happened in Kosovo. And so that if you look at the circumstances and how he talks about it, they mirror the circumstances of what happened both in Iraq and in Kosovo as well, right? And the West basically going in unilaterally without anybody else saying it's okay, and the justification for it being ethnic cleansing. So just think about that, and then how the rest of the world saw what the US did in Iraq, and then that being portrayed in China as actually a defense of territory, of people that really rightly belong within the territory of, I wouldn't quite go that far, but I would say that there's definitely not much condemnation from what I can see within the Chinese media, and they've been quite careful about not condemning Russia, right? So they regret the lives of civilians that have been killed, and the language is much more about sadness that people are dying, but not condemnation about who is doing what. So just, that relationship that Flo was asking about earlier, I'm not really a China expert, but I think we can say that, or I could fairly say, just looking at people who are China and Russia experts, that there is not straight consensus about what China knew or didn't know beforehand. And there's a lot of disagreement about whether what has been happening, China is trying to distance itself from, or is actually quite happy about, both of which are, they could both be simultaneously true, right? So we could be happy, China could be happy that all this is happening because basically they want, as I've argued, I think on Twitter, that China actually wants a little sister that is much more compliant, right? Instead of a partnership that is closer to equals. You could also see that China might be kind of quite despairing about what's happening because this other power that they have put forward as their partner is not doing well in this war, and that's also making them look bad by association, right? So both of these things are possible at the same time. If you also just look at what India is saying about this issue, I think many people were surprised by this. And it goes back to, and this is where history comes in, right? So Russia supported India in the India-Pakistani conflict way back and has always stood by and has had a surprisingly close relationship with India. And so, but people were really surprised that India did not come out and condemn Russia. So there are all of these, you're sort of digging up all of these backstories around the relationships between countries that you wouldn't necessarily think about. And I would say, if you really want to see what's going on, go look at the UN General Assembly vote that happened very shortly after the condemnation and look at how countries voted. That is a very good indication of all of the things that are going on. And they're basically a summary of where the different countries stand for a whole variety of reasons, some of which have to do with military aid, economic aid, long-term historical relationships, communist ties, so on and so forth. You'll sort of see it all there, and you'll see surprises too, right? So Cuba and Russia, for example, Cuba did not come out and vote in favor of Russia. That was a big surprise, right? I think Venezuela didn't even bother showing up for the vote, right? Another big surprise. So there are these little surprises in there if you're looking for alignments that don't show up. And that helps us understand, oh, actually, there's a bit more to this dynamic than we think. The abstentions tell you a lot. The abstentions often mean we want to vote with Russia, but we can't because we are being constrained for one reason or another, right? So, and there are a lot of countries that would probably have rather abstained, but were probably pressured into voting, in favor of probably, from the Western countries. They went and said, look, you better do this or else, right? And the or else might have been left unsaid. So the vote, you have to look carefully at the dynamics of that, but there are all sorts of reasons why, Kenya is not necessarily pro-US in the way that we might think, but they are very wary of imperialist power and colonialism and the discussion around ethno-nationalism, right? So the motivations just vary all over the place. And I would say, look deeply at people's interests and what they're doing.
Yeah, I see your hands raised, Flo.
Thank you. I thought that was a really interesting observation and analysis, Christine. Thank you. I suppose following on from that, I wonder whether what we will see in Europe is actually a growth of the European Union and NATO itself becoming stronger, because those countries in NATO will wish to feel that they are supported one with another, and that, for example, Poland, if it's invaded by the Soviet Union, there you go, that's it, by Russia, if it's invaded by Russia, that actually it will be able to call on assistance from all of those other NATO countries. And the interesting thing will be to see if Finland and Sweden ultimately join. Okay, because if they do, that will tell us something else as well, I think. But when we look at what's happening in relation to Russia, I think one of the amazing things is that, I suppose, if you like, when you look at the way the landmass is in terms of Ukraine, there is a huge potential there for growth. That is growth in terms of agriculture, which will then become, in effect, the basket for the whole of Western Europe. So that you've got you've got all sorts of power potentially there too. And I wondered whether Russia didn't see that as making it able to have cash coming in through a different source, because at some point people are going to stop using Russian oil and Russian coal, Russian gas. So I think that was another instance I wanted to say. And the third point I wanted to make in relation to what you just said about those who support and not support is the situation in Hungary with Orban's victory, because obviously that is going to have an impact in Hungary, but actually also on the adjoining nations, to see how that pans out. Because if Orban says we want to rejoin Russia as part of a new union, that is going to create huge problems. And they will do that depending on how they see things panning out. So I just think there's an awful lot there that perhaps we're not talking about, not thinking about, and not, as you have indicated, Christine, giving due relevance to in the discussions that we're having.
Thank you, Flo. Being aware of time, Irina, did you want to say anything about the European aspect of that quickly before you go, or?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm so sorry I have to leave at 8, but very quickly on Hungary. I mean, for me, if there is one silver lining, if there ever is anything such a thing in such a terrible time, it is that, of course, now Hungary is isolated within the European Union. Poland has now distanced itself, and Poland used to back up Hungary in the Article 7 proceedings against Hungary. So they backed each other up, rather. So now there is a much better chance that Hungary can be isolated, can be punished, can't be kicked out, of course, because there is no such mechanism in the European Union treaties. But there could be much harder biting financial punishment, or of course Hungary could choose a Hexit, I suppose, and leave. And that in many ways would be good for the EU, because it would then be able to continue on the basis of shared values without a rogue state in its midst. It would be bad in the way that, of course, you would have another threat on the borders of Europe. And Serbia was mentioned, where also the nationalist party incumbent won the elections on the same day. And that is also, of course, well, it's not a member state yet, very close to Europe's eastern border. So there clearly is a new Iron Curtain coming down. The question is where exactly, and who will find themselves on which side of this within Europe. As I said, it is to be hoped that amongst the liberal pro-European Western countries, plus the UK, with a bit of optimism, there will be some form of union that will include some foreign and security and potential defense policy, which will complement, not replace, NATO.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you for joining us.
I'm so sorry I have to leave, but thank you for a really, really exciting debate. And obviously, I'm hoping to join you again very soon. Bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye. So, moving on to another question that I can see here in the chat, which I find is always quite an interesting thing to bring up in terms of foreign policy, from Ruth Coleman Taylor. Can we or should we evolve a woman's view of the future, for example, building on modern communications to share information of what's happening in the world and to share criticism and concerns as events develop? And I think the reason I've chosen this one is because in international relations, you kind of have this sense of women as peacemakers or women as the representation of, or the embodiment of peace as being mothers, sisters, etc., etc. We've already discussed that women are soldiers, women are refugees, there are women on the sanctions list for being members of Russian state bodies and being complicit in the occupation of Crimea. So is it possible to have a woman's view of the future where women are just as men are on all sides of the conflict? Caitlin, I see your hands up.
Yeah, it's obviously coming at it from a social media side of things. I think that's what's so exciting about the sort of the times that we live in, is with access to social media, everyone has the opportunity to tell their story. You don't have to just rely on state media, for example. You don't have to rely on old boys clubs. Anyone and everyone can tell their side of the story, and that's really, really good in this case, because it means that people that usually wouldn't get that airtime, namely women are notoriously underrepresented in most every field, unfortunately. And so women can use social media to really get their side of things out there, where other parts of the media might not be willing to give them airtime. And we have seen this happening on social media. You look at the pictures and videos of the leader of our sister party, I can't remember her name, but doing incredibly brave things when no one would blame them for leaving. Absolutely no one would blame them for leaving and going to a safe country, and they're staying and they're fighting, just as the men are fighting, just as everyone else is. And so I think that's what's so great about social media, is that we can use it to further these stories and to further these examples that it's not just the men, it's everyone. It really exemplifies how this is such a defensive war for Ukraine, because it is everyone having to get involved. And as heartbreaking as it is, we're seeing young people. We're talking to people in our sister organizations, YL sister organizations, where they're sat there in our executive meeting and our international officer comes in and tells us that he's just been talking to people who've been learning to make Molotov cocktails. And it's heartbreaking, but it is, I really strongly believe, the single best tool that they have at their disposal to get their side of the story across. I cannot possibly believe that we would be hearing in any other time without social media.
Yeah, and I think that if you speak about conflict in general, beyond just Ukraine, I think the flip side of this idea that we used to have sort of it still persists, but in the 2000s, of women as peacemakers was absolutely turned on its head by the woman of ISIS, the woman of Daesh, recruiting young women on social media to join the caliphate. And I think that we can see now that it's much, much more complex than we used to think it was, and act like it was back in the end of 2003 Afghanistan, Iraq time period in terms of women in conflict. I can see we've got two hands up. Ruth, this was your question and I asked it for you, so I'm going to let you come in and say things.
Right, well, thank you very much. It seems to me that what is nice about this meeting is it isn't a row of male heads. And is there anything different? And I think we do seem to have this guilt tripping of ourselves that, you know, we're intelligent women holding serious positions. So we're going to give the same kind of intellectual response as a man in a suit. And you know, I mean, when I was in the Young Liberals 50 years ago, what we were all trying not to be was a substitute man in a suit. And I think we've got to be very careful about whether we have a distinctive role to play. Because, I mean, all the things like Holocaust Day and so on have this message about we're not going to forget. We will not forget. We will remember the appalling things that have been done and try to make sure it doesn't happen again. And I think that the idea of the war crimes trials does provide a possible endpoint to one set of events. But if and only if that is incorporated in public behaviour by changing what is acceptable in public behaviour. And I mean, I do think that Ukraine is very fortunate both in its location and its highly charismatic leader. Because when Russia was land grabbing further into its Asian area, I mean, there were things in the newspaper about Chechnya and so on, but nothing major. And no great demands to go and help them, to try and defend them in international fora and so on. And, you know, it's tempting to say, well, that gave the message that was tolerable behaviour. A state could do that. And in a sense, what's different here is that we can see it better. Unlike these other countries which Russia land grabbed, Ukraine is not a small country far away of which we know nothing. It's somewhere very nearby, somewhere that has been endeavouring to join the whole sort of European cultural and political world for quite a long time now. And you know, I mean, the Russian soldiers said, who are we supposed to shoot? They all look like us. Well, the Ukrainians all look like us as well, don't they? And their aspirations overlap with ours. So I suppose I'm saying, do we as a women's organisation have a role to generate a distinctive point of view and criticism, and to mobilise perhaps with women's organisations in other countries as well, and talk about the future, as it were, that if all the chaps are busy getting better weapons and, you know, rereading their Clausewitz to see what's the best strategy in the war, which really took me back to university days, is somebody going to keep an eye on the future and what sort of future we want? And the structures that were created after a lot of thought and discussion at the end of the Second World War don't seem to be working as they were intended, or they've got a lot of unexpected consequences. Who's going to do the criticism and help to build the future? Otherwise, we just have the same sort of future as we had in the past. How many more Ukraines is it going to take? So I'm suggesting we should think about whether that is a responsibility or a duty or a job that we could do, because we may not be entirely co-opted into the politics practiced by men in suits.
In many parts of the world, it has been women who have sat down and said this far and no more, and have spearheaded peace movements and won international awards for it. I see your hands up, Flo.
Just a quickie. I think you've raised something really interesting, Ruth. And I suppose my next statement, I hope, will not frighten people. And it's this. The ALDE party, of which the UK is a member, is having its Congress in June, 2nd to the 4th in Dublin. I wonder whether this is the opportunity for WLD to take a resolution to that body and say, this needs to happen. We need to have a different way of looking at things, and we need the voice of women across Europe, yes, but also across the wider world. And we've got UCLG, which is a global organization that might well be affiliated with that. And perhaps that's something that we could think about. And as part of that, I see somebody's mentioned Northern Ireland. Well, let's look too at South Africa, because what happened there when the governance of that country changed and a lot of what had happened came to light was that there was a truth commission. And perhaps one of the things we could encourage is the establishment of a truth commission that wouldn't simply be the old guard ticking the box, the men in suits, as Ruth has called them, but would actually be something different. And maybe we could do that this year rather than waiting next year, year after that, and see things happen. Because frankly, if we don't do it, who will? Yes. Who will? So let's do it. Let's have a go. Can't hurt.
Yeah. If not now, when?
Exactly, Ruth.
Yes, I, again, with my ALD person hat on, we need to start getting prepared now for Congress if we are going to do things, if you wish to do things. There is also a potential for party members who are not elected to the delegation to also attend Congress, if that would be something that is of interest to you. And I believe there'll be an email going around about that very, very shortly. And I would, of course, welcome more women and more people of all non-male genders on the delegation. So yeah, I can definitely kind of share this details with you as and when they come out. But we will be in Dublin and we would love to see you with us. Helen, your hand's up.
I suppose I'm going to just take Flo on there. So as chair of Lib Dem Women, how could anyone resist that call to arms? Oh, what unfortunate language. Call to put down arms. And Christine's put some really helpful comments. I think we have actually in this group some fantastic content, some fantastic contacts, and certainly something we can look at working with you, Hannah. And I'm sure our members would be really interested. We've already done it with the Violence Against Women and Girls in terms of pulling together a working group who put something through to conference. And I'm sure it would be great to work with young Liberals as well, who I'm sure will be really keen. So let's look to see if we can get some momentum going from this session. I'll leave it at that, but I'll hand back to the panel and to questions.
Okay. Yes. So if you have a working group, then and you're putting things forward to conference, that's definitely a good kind of launching point, because a lot of the time when we do post things to ALD, they are based on things you've already passed through conference. And anyway, I am digressing again. Let me scroll back up to the questions. What can we do as individuals in the UK to help support Ukraine in the war beyond just donating to charities and organisations? And that's from Ben Fulsham. Apologies if I've mispronounced your surname. Do we have any takers? Oh, okay. That was a split second. I will go Caitlin, then Flo.
Thanks. Yeah, I didn't have a huge amount to add, but everyone else has been quiet, so I thought I'd put my hand up. I just wanted to Yeah, I think in terms of, obviously besides donating, if you're in a privileged enough position where you can open your home to Ukrainian refugees, that is of course an incredible thing that you could do. And obviously not everyone's going to be in the position where they can do that, and it's not something we've really been pushing in Young Liberals in particular, because the vast majority of our membership obviously aren't in that position. In terms of the other things, I mean, and this is something that we as an organization, as Young Liberals, can't officially endorse because it's not necessarily 100% safe, but we are aware of Young Liberals, not just from the UK, but from Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland, Austria, all around Europe, literally forming convoys, taking humanitarian aid to the border and coming back, and bringing refugees back towards Western Europe. And so if you are so minded, there are opportunities to actually go over to the border in Poland and Romania and to help out there with regards to humanitarian aid, especially if you're first aid trained, for example. And so that's, yeah, while that's not something that we can officially endorse because it's inherently very risky, that is another option that I know some people do feel inclined to take.
Thank you. Before I bring in Flo, I'll just say that in your local area, there may be people who need assistance with sorting donations to bring to the border. That was the case up until very recently in Brussels. I did a lot of folding of clothes and sorting into boxes to be sent out to the border. And this might be something people haven't necessarily thought of before, but as a friend of mine who is not a native Ukrainian speaker, but is fairly fluent in it, and he said to me, learn Ukrainian, because a lot of what this is an attempt to eradicate a culture and a people, and that it's really important to respect Ukraine as a nation, as a community, and that something we can do is to help understand that and make sure that that cannot be defeated no matter what happens. I saw Flo, you had your hand up, I believe, as well.
Yeah. A couple of things really. The first is that when people arrive in this country as refugees, very often they've got nothing, not even a mobile phone. And a mobile phone can actually help keep them in touch with family. And so one of the things that can be done is that local people, and this is happening already in Cheltenham, can actually get mobile phones that are no longer wanted, iPads, tablets, computers no longer wanted. And we actually have a charity here that will completely refurbish them. And we can then give them to those people and organizations so that refugees can keep in touch with family. And we also look at providing vouchers, because if you haven't got, if you might have the computer, but if you haven't got internet connection, hell, you got nothing. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that in the next 4 weeks, there are going to be elections in all sorts of places in this country. And perhaps one of the things that we can do is actually hold the Conservatives up to take account of what they're doing. So Ms. Patel, for example, making it so difficult for refugees to come to the UK, that should be part of what we do as part of our electioneering. And here is an opportunity for us as local representatives to get out and actually move that message forward. Lots of people want to help. One way they might help is by sending the government a message. And that message could be massive losses in the local election campaigns. So there are two things briefly that could be done. And I hope we will be able to do them.
I'm not sure this is happening in the UK, but in Belgium, a lot of, if not all of the large telecoms companies will provide SIM cards to people with Ukrainian passports. If you go into a shop, they'll just give you a Proximus SIM, for example. So these kind of public-private partnerships are very well kind of developed and established in Belgium, at least. Do we have any more for any more? We've got another municipal one. would twinning between towns/cities help, as this is already established between us and many other European countries? I know we've used our twin partnerships to great effect in Poland to campaign for LGBT rights on a local level. But how can twinning, and I actually asked this question as well, how can liberals help their twin cities in Ukraine and the neighboring countries that are hosting refugees? I have muted myself without inviting anyone else to speak. Come on, you're raising your eyebrows at me, Flo. That means let me speak.
I feel as if I've hogged this. I don't really want to be honest. Yes, your twinning organisations can help, and they can help because they actually have connections with places. Let me just give you one example. Friedland in Germany. They have actually developed a situation where they have refugees in, and in order to cement the relationship between those refugees and the local community, one of the things they've done is actually to do artwork on the walls in and around the town, working together with local young people. It makes a difference. And your twinning organizations, as with the ones here in Cheltenham and Cheltenham for Europe, they actually are very active in that way. And also, of course, because they have the connections, what it means is that they can go directly to people who can make a difference in those countries and make a difference for the ordinary Ukrainians that are seeking help and advice. So from that perspective, yes. And if you look at the CEMR website, you will see that twinning organizations across Europe are being encouraged to do this with the sort of help that they can give, actually mentioned on the webpage.
Thank you. I see you also want to jump in, Ruth.
Yes, I was going to ask Flo if information about this could be shared and perhaps shared more widely around the party, because I suspect quite a lot of people are also in local twinning groups. So perhaps you could make sure that we know about it, and perhaps Women Lib Dems could circulate it as well, put some information on the website and so on. And because nobody wants to be the first one to have to invent it. But if they can see somebody else is doing something and it works, then I think that's encouraging. And it also emphasises the importance of our international connections, which is not always recognised in our regular political work.
Okay, thank you. Helen, you're raising your hand.
I am, and I'm going to be cheeky because Hannah, I don't know if you've got a final question for people, but I've got one I'd like to ask. Am I being cheeky, or do you want to ask a final question?
You are not. I am more than content for anyone else to contribute as much as they desire.
So I'm just curious, because one of the things we wanted to talk about here as well is the impact on liberal democracy. And where, because I don't know about anybody else if they felt a step change in the narrative. The way Putin went in, the narrative seems to have shifted a lot, at least in the West. The rest of the world's different matter, but NATO in the West, it's changed. So I suppose just one kind of question to the panelists. How are you feeling about the future of liberal democracy within the context of this war now, and what its future, I suppose, what its future look like, and whether or not how important, I suppose, this war is to its future? An easy one to end it.
There was very definitively, I think, in Europe, in the absence of Irina, I'm not going to kind of claim to be as much of a European expert as she is, but as a Brussels-based person, as I said, there was very much how we did things before and how we do things now that are entirely different. Is a shift change in how Europe functions completely. I mean, I said to my colleague a few weeks ago, it would have been absolutely unthinkable for Europe as a soft power organization to send weapons things have just changed so dramatically in terms of the basic understanding that we have of the EU as a foreign policy power in the matter of a month. But I am not a panelist. I will let you do your thing. Who do we want to have first from the panel? I see you've got your hand raised, Ruth, but I'm going to let the panelists kind of jump in first, and then I'll do that one. Don't all rush at once. Christine.
Not that I really have an answer for you, Helen. Okay, so how am I feeling about the future of liberal democracy? Not great. I haven't been feeling great about it since the Iraq War, though, to be honest. And I don't think that this is a particularly good development. Not very helpful for liberal democracy at all, despite some of the things that I think we could look at as the silver lining in the dark cloud, right? So the silver lining is, I think, Europe all of a sudden has more of a purpose and more unity than maybe we ever thought was possible. I think we've pulled together in a crisis rather well. We've decided that this is something worth fighting for, and we've decided together that this is a moment that we are all going to fight for. At least, you know, right now we've decided that. I don't know how well that's going to hold together. But still, having said that, I think Putin was incredibly surprised by the united reaction. I think Biden did a spectacular job of handling the intelligence and leaking that out in advance. That was a masterful move. And I think he's done an excellent job of rallying NATO from behind without telling the EU what to do, right? So I think there are a number of things that came together very well. And I think Zelensky has proven to be a wonderfully charismatic moral figure in this story. He is in many ways, you know, he plays the character of the president that he did in the TV show that he starred in, right? This is some kind of weird Hollywood tale in a way, like a blockbuster action movie that's gone crazily wrong and right at the same time in strange ways. So I think, you know, in all of those ways, this war has come out much better than it could have, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the outcome is positive. And I say that because it feels to me like it marks a division that has been, I think, building, but it just feels much more clear to me that there will be that division, right? So I feel like what China is going to take away from this, and this goes back to the questions that Flo was asking earlier. If I were China, and what I would take away from this is, I really want to take Taiwan, and my question is when and how, and then what can I learn from this experience so that I can coup-proof so that I can learn all the lessons that from this situation so that I can do it properly when it comes time. And I'm not making this up out of nowhere, right? This is, Taiwan feels like it's going to happen within the next 5 years. If you just go into the analysis and look at it from the Taiwanese side, they're quite fearful. And I think Xi Jinping has always felt like Taiwan is a part of China in a way that isn't the same as Ukraine, right? It is the historical narrative. China will come down very, very hard on anybody who decides otherwise. I think there are only maybe 4 remaining independent countries in the world that have not towed the line on Taiwan. And when they decide not to toe the line, then China punishes them very, very harshly, right? So there are, and that didn't used to be the case. Not as China has grown stronger, the number of countries that dare to contradict China on that front has grown from, I don't know, maybe like a few dozen to 4, or something less than 10 anyway. So, and they're all very, very tiny countries, right? So this is just to say that the dynamic of this has changed. And if anything, I think that the China-Russia alliance will be stronger, and there are ways around this. This is not inevitable, but the direction of travel to me looks like I'm not quite sure if it's a Cold War too, but it is definitely one set of countries and another set of countries, and maybe a third set of non-aligned countries who are trying to, you know, going back to the Indias who want it and need it both ways, right? So, and we're not quite sure where the Erdogans of the world are going to fall on this spectrum, where the Brazils and the Philippines, you know, where are they going to go? A number of African countries have obligations on both sides, and it's just not going to look as neat. Before, I would say the big thing coming out of this is the constraint of American and Western power. That's the thing to look for. Before, American power was not restrained, and now it just clearly looks to me like it really is. And that's I think that's the marker. So just those are the things that are going through my head. That doesn't mean that liberal democracy can't thrive. It's just, I think it's got a smaller space to thrive in. And the competition of ideologies looks much more stark. And the more that basically China does well economically and militarily, the more it looks like an ideological competition and an ideological rival. So there are very real systems, and I just think that the UK is completely asleep to this, and I think that Europe is completely asleep to this. I think that the Americans are generally, they're more aware of this, but they don't understand that it isn't just about power. They have to understand too that there is an attractiveness to the model that I don't think people are in the West are giving China credit for. And I think that's going to come home to bite us back.
I could make probably 2 or 3 different comments kind of jumping off the back of this, but I'm not going to because it's 8:30 UK time. I see that Ruth, I'll let you make a quick comment and then we'll kind of move towards closing statements and LDW's housekeeping bits and pieces. We are both on mute. You are still on mute. We can't hear you, Ruth.
Sorry. Yeah, unmute yourself and do it again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you. That's awesome.
Oh, good. Right. So 4 tries and then it worked. I mean, I think it was interesting and impressive that in the middle of the war, President Zelensky took time out to come to an ALDE meeting and asked to join. And that, in fact, there will be a discussion at the ALDE Congress in June about whether the Servant of the People Party becomes a normal member of ALDE and is therefore effectively a fellow Liberal Democrat group and perspective. And we need to take that on board, that is the future they're looking for. They may not have spent time working it out. We've got some time in the day to work out how we think liberal democracy can work in the future, and what can it help to grow and what can it help to prevent. And I do think we've got to focus on the future. I mean, looking at the past is good to learn some lessons, but it's what happens next that is going to create the opportunity for future generations and perhaps make them think differently and be more effective than perhaps we and our parents and grandparents have been.
Thank you, Ruth. And on that, we're going to kind of move towards a closing statement. So first, I will allow LDW to thank everyone. Helen?
Yeah, thank you so much to our fantastic panelists for coming to this event. It's just been so fascinating to have all these different perspectives, all from fantastic women as well. I'm also going to make a shameless plug. Please do join Liberal Democrat Women if you're not already a member. We are a totally inclusive women's organisation, so every gender can join. And so please do, and to help us support more events like this and to increasingly, get our members more active and to do great things like this, and also what we've just managed to devise as part of this as well, writing policy and making an impact in both the UK and Europe. Thanks very much, and thank you again to our fantastic panelists, and also, of course, to Hannah for a fantastically chaired event.
Thank you very much. I was very happy to chair this and to speak with such exciting and interesting panelists, and to speak with thank you all for coming and for contributing your views and ideas to this as well. I will allow the panel very, very quickly, if you have anything that you want to specifically say that we should take away from this discussion that you haven't had a chance to say, or anything else that you very, very briefly want to add as a closing statement, that would be fine. Otherwise, yeah, I see you, Flo.
Okay, just to say, I wouldn't necessarily agree with Christine's analysis. I think that liberal democracy is something that has to thrive, because if it doesn't, then the future looks pretty damn bleak to me, frankly. And that means that if it's going to thrive, we have to ensure it has life, that our young people understand what it means and how to get involved, and that we understand what the benefits of being liberal democracies and liberal democrats mean. And the final point I'd say is, one of the great things that I think we will be taking from all of these events is the fact that the UK on its own is in real trouble. And so actually it may well open the door at some point into the future to rejoining the EU, to being part of that bigger European family, as other countries will wish to be, and that the benefits that will accrue from that, I think, will help every single one of us. And thank you all. I think it's been a most informative and educative program. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yes, thank you very much to the Young Liberals as well for all the contribution that you've put into this. I think that although I don't want to necessarily hog the spotlight to be the final, leave the final remark, but before we started this, I said that there's an EU diplomatic order where the member states are listed, and that when I'm no longer a young liberal, perhaps I'm in my 50s, what I want to do is walk past the European Parliament and see the UK and Ukraine in the diplomatic order next to each other. And on that's more hopeful note, I will wish you all a very good evening. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.